What if the most dangerous spy in the Middle East never fired a weapon, never crossed a border in disguise, never wore a false beard or carried a forged passport? What if he just showed up to work every morning, turned on the lights, and asked his patients to open their mouths? There is a dental clinic in southern Lebanon. Small, unremarkable. The kind of place you walk past 100 times without registering it. Whitewashed walls, a handwritten sign, a waiting room with plastic chairs and old magazines. For 20 years, the community around it trusted the man inside. They sent him their children. They called him when the pain became unbearable at midnight. They sat in his chair, tilted their heads back, and let him work in silence. He was the most trusted man in the neighborhood. That is not an accident. That is the entire operation. In May 2000, Israel withdrew from southern Lebanon after an 18-year occupation. The withdrawal was not orderly. It was a collapse. Soldiers pulling back faster than anyone had planned. Checkpoints abandoned overnight. Roads that had been Israeli-controlled at dawn falling silent by afternoon. For the South Lebanon Army, the Lebanese militia that had fought alongside Israel for years, the withdrawal was a death sentence. Hezbollah moved through the south like a tide. SLA members who could not reach the border in time were arrested. Some were executed. The ones who made it across the border into Israel were resettled, given housing, given a new life on the condition that the old one was over. Farouk's brother was one of them. He crossed in May 2000 and did not come back. Farouk did not cross. He had a clinic. He had patients who needed him. He had a life built over 20 years in a town called Marjayun, in the rolling hills of southern Lebanon, where everyone knew everyone, and a man's reputation was the only currency that actually mattered. He stayed. He kept his head down. He kept his appointment book full. For 4 years, he lived inside that silence. He did not speak about his brother. He did not answer questions about the SLA. In a community where Hezbollah had become the government, the army, the social infrastructure, and the moral authority simultaneously, the only safe response to the past was to have no past at all. He treated Hezbollah fighters. He treated their families. He treated the men who had been on the opposite side of checkpoints from his brother 4 years earlier. He was professional. He was calm. He did not flinch. And slowly, over 4 years, the suspicion that might have followed a man whose brother had fled to Israel calcified into something else, accepted history. Everyone knew about the brother. Everyone had moved on. Farouk had stayed. That staying was its own proof of loyalty. He had no idea yet that it was also his most valuable professional credential. In 2004, a man came to the clinic for a routine cleaning. He was not a patient. He was a message from Farouk's brother in Israel, delivered through a channel that had taken months to establish carefully enough to risk using. We do not know the exact words spoken in that room. What we know is that a meeting was arranged, a handler was introduced, an offer was made. Here is what intelligence recruiters understand that most people do not. The most useful assets are not people who need to be convinced. They are people who have already decided, privately, quietly, in the part of themselves they never show anyone, and simply need someone to hand them a direction. Farouk had spent 4 years watching Hezbollah govern the community around him. He had treated their wounded after the 2006 war would not arrive for 2 more years, but the infrastructure of that war was already being built around him. Weapons stored in buildings he drove past every morning. Commanders who spoke in front of him because he was furniture, trusted enough to be invisible. And his brother, the only family he had left, was across a border that had no legal crossing point, no phone call that was safe to make, no letter that could be sent without interception. He said yes. and Mossad gave him something that most deep cover operations require months to construct from scratch. They gave him nothing, because the cover already existed, 20 years of it, a life that no fabricated legend could replicate, because it was not fabricated at all. The most unbreakable identity is not the one you build. It is the one you have already lived. The modification to the examination light was not complicated. A dental overhead fixture is positioned directly above the patient's reclined face. The patient tilts their head back. Their eyes close or squint against the brightness. They open their mouths and become, for the duration of the appointment, completely still, fully exposed, unavoidable. A concealed camera embedded in the fixture photographs everything above the chair at controlled intervals. The patient never looks up at the light. No one looks directly into the source of brightness, not deliberately, not without squinting, not for long enough to notice anything unusual in the housing. The images captured were not surveillance quality blurs. They were clinical quality photographs of faces at close range, in good light, with the subject perfectly positioned and completely unaware. For an intelligence service trying to build a visual database of an organization whose senior members had made themselves deliberately invisible. No public appearances, no media, no social media, no photographs that could be captured remotely. This was not a minor capability. This was the only camera in southern Lebanon that Hezbollah's commanders willingly sat in front of. But here is the question the operation immediately raises, the one that Mossad's planners would have sat with, in whatever room they made these decisions, for a long time before proceeding. How do you get the photographs out? A camera embedded in a dental light is only useful if the images can reach Tel Aviv. And in southern Lebanon in 2004, with Hezbollah running its own surveillance of the community, with informants in every neighborhood, with a counterintelligence apparatus that had spent years learning exactly what Israeli tradecraft looked like, every transfer of data is a moment of maximum exposure. Every handoff is the operation's most vulnerable second. Farouk was not a trained intelligence officer. He had not spent months at a facility learning dead drops and counter-surveillance routes and the 17 ways to detect a tail on a Lebanese market street. He was a dentist, a very good dentist, whose hands had to remain steady enough to work in people's mouths 6 days a week, while also carrying information that, if discovered, would end his life. The data transfers were physical. No digital network. No encrypted transmission that could be intercepted and traced. The information moved the same way information moved in this part of the world for centuries, by hand, through trusted channels, disguised inside the ordinary texture of daily life. Which means Farouk had to perform 2 simultaneous roles, indefinitely, without a single person in his daily life knowing about either one. The dentist who everyone trusted, and the man who was betraying everyone who trusted him. There is a detail in the operation that gets overlooked in most accounts of what happened. Farouk's brother's SLA connection was not a secret in Marjayoun. It was known. People were aware, and yet Farouk was trusted anyway, because he had stayed, and because enough time had passed, and because the community had made its peace with his family's complicated history. That known history, the one that should have made him a permanent suspect, was the thing that was actually protecting him. Hezbollah's counterintelligence was looking for people who were hiding something. Farouk was not hiding his brother. Everyone knew about his brother. The thing he was hiding was invisible precisely because the thing that should have revealed it was already out in the open. The deception was working, but not for the reasons Mossad intended. And somewhere in that gap between why the cover should have worked and why it was actually working, there was a vulnerability that nobody had fully mapped yet. The question is, did anyone notice it before it became a problem? For the first 2 years, the operation ran with a quietness that was almost more unsettling than tension. Patients came. Patience left. The light stayed on. The images accumulated in a concealed device no larger than a thumb, transferred during moments so ordinary they would be invisible to any observer. A stop at a market, a handshake outside a mosque, a parcel passed between men who had known each other for years and had no reason to behave unusually because they were not behaving unusually. Farouk kept his appointment book full. He kept his hands steady. He kept his face exactly as it had always been, calm, professional, slightly tired in the way that all men in their 50s who have worked with their hands for decades are slightly tired. He did not change his routine. He did not buy anything new. He did not ask questions he had not asked before. He was, by every visible measure, exactly who he had always been. And that performance, the performance of complete, uninterrupted normalcy, is the most exhausting thing a human being can be asked to sustain. Not because it requires dramatic acting, because it requires the suppression of every instinct that crisis produces. The urge to check over your shoulder. The urge to pause before answering a question that has never required pausing before. The urge, in moments of unexpected silence, to fill it with words that explain too much. Farouk had none of the institutional support that trained intelligence officers carry into the field. No protocol for what to do if a patient asked the wrong question. No abort signal he could send in under 60 seconds. No extraction timeline he had personally reviewed and memorized. He had a contact channel, a transfer method, and the instruction to continue until told otherwise. He was alone in the way that only an asset who has not been trained can be alone. Because trained officers understand the loneliness is part of the architecture. Farouk understood it as a condition he simply had to endure. In 2006, everything around him caught fire. The 34-day war between Israel and Hezbollah devastated southern Lebanon. Israeli airstrikes hit infrastructure across the region, roads, bridges, communications networks, buildings that intelligence assessments had identified as Hezbollah-affiliated. The community Farouk had lived in for over 2 decades was, in significant parts, destroyed. He watched it from inside. He treated the wounded who arrived at makeshift facilities near his clinic. He listened to people describe what had been hit and where, and he understood, with a knowledge that nobody around him shared, why certain locations had been targeted with the precision they had been targeted. He had provided some of those coordinates. This is the moment the operation's human cost becomes impossible to abstract away. Intelligence analysis can render a building into a set of grid coordinates. It can process a name into a target designation. It can transform a community into a data set. The analyst who does that work does it from a distance, physical, psychological, moral, that the asset on the ground does not have. Farouk had no distance. The people whose locations he had reported were his neighbors. The infrastructure he had mapped was the infrastructure his patients drove past every morning. The wounded in front of him had names he recognized. He could not mourn in any way that was visible. He could not allow his expression, in the wrong moment, in front of the wrong person, to carry the particular weight of a man who knows more than he is showing. Grief and guilt wear the same face, and any deviation from the expected sadness, expected anger at Israel, expected solidarity with the community, would be a thread that a careful observer could pull. So he performed grief the way the community around him performed it. He said the right things. He was present where presence was required. He was appropriately angry at the right targets, in the right company, in the right tone. And he kept his appointment book full. Here is what changed after 2006, and what most accounts of this operation fail to examine carefully. Before the war, Farouk's intelligence value was primarily photographic and geographic, faces, locations, infrastructure maps. The requests from his handler were patient. Build the picture slowly. Identify who comes to the clinic. Note what they say, if they say anything. The operation was running on a timeline measured in years, not months. After 2006, the requests changed. They became specific in a way that earlier requests had not been. Coordinates needed to be accurate to within meters. Movement patterns needed to be reported within hours of observation, not compiled over weeks. The nature of the information being requested had shifted from intelligence building to something closer to targeting preparation. For Farouk, this shift created a new category of risk that had not existed before. Providing general intelligence about an organization is one level of exposure. Providing real-time operational intelligence, the kind that can be used immediately, for a specific purpose, within a specific window, is another level entirely. If Hezbollah counterintelligence ever traced a strike or an operation back to the intelligence that enabled it, and then traced that intelligence back to its source, the timeline would become very short. The operation was accelerating, and acceleration is when covers break. There is a detail in the public record of Farouk's 2011 arrest and tribunal that receives almost no attention. The Lebanese security forces who eventually moved against him did not arrest him because they had identified him as a Mossad asset. They arrested him because a pattern had emerged, behavioral, technical, relational, that flagged him for investigation. The investigation came first. The confirmation came second, which means that for some period of time before his arrest, Farouk was under investigation without knowing he was under investigation. He was being watched by people who were not yet certain what they were watching, but were certain enough to keep watching. Now consider what that means for the operation's entire preceding history. The assumption, the one that Mossad's operational planners built the entire architecture around, was that Farouk's established community status and his openly known family history were sufficient cover. That the known SLA connection, paradoxically, neutralized suspicion by being visible. That his 20 years in Marjayoun were an impenetrable legend. That assumption was partially wrong. It was not wrong about the cover. The cover held for years, exactly as intended. But the cover held for a reason that had nothing to do with its design. It held because Hezbollah's counterintelligence, in the years immediately following the 2000 withdrawal, was focused on a different threat profile entirely. Recent arrivals, new relationships, people asking unusual questions. Farouk failed every single criteria on that threat profile. So he was not looked at, but threat profiles change. Organizations learn. The counterintelligence apparatus that Hezbollah ran in 2004 was not the same one running in 2008. The 2006 war had taught them, at enormous cost, that their operational security had gaps they had not identified. They rebuilt their internal surveillance methodology from scratch. And when the new methodology was applied retrospectively, when analysts began re-examining known individuals in the South using updated criteria, the picture around Farouk began to acquire a different shape. His brother's SLA connection, which had been accepted as historical fact and therefore dismissed, was re-examined as a potential active vulnerability. His financial patterns, which had not changed, which showed no sudden wealth, which appeared completely normal, were nevertheless scrutinized for the invisible signs of a man maintaining a careful performance of normalcy. The cover was not blown by a mistake. It was eroded by time and by an adversary that got better. There was a conversation, we do not know exactly when, or through exactly what channel, in which the option of ending the operation was raised. This is not speculation. It is the inference that every intelligence professional draws from the timeline. A 9-year operation does not run continuously without reassessment. Assets are reviewed. Risk calculations are updated. At some point between 2006 and 2009, someone in the operations chain looked at what was being asked of Farouk, the accelerating requests, the post-war heat, the rebuilt Hezbollah counterintelligence infrastructure, and weighed it against what continued operation was actually producing. The decision was made to continue. We do not know who made that decision. We do not know whether Farouk was consulted about his own assessment of the risk level. We do not know whether the handler communicated to Farouk that the risk profile had changed, or whether Farouk was simply told to continue and left to manage his own fear privately. What we know is that he continued. The appointment book stayed full. The lights stayed on. And somewhere in the months before 2011, in a building that Farouk did not know existed, people who had not existed as a threat when the operation began were constructing, piece by piece, a case against a dentist in Marjayoun, whose 20 years of community trust were about to mean exactly nothing. The question that remains, the one that the intelligence record cannot fully answer, is this. At what point did Farouk understand that the operation had outlasted its own safety margin? And when that understanding arrived, did he try to stop? The phone was the mistake that almost ended everything before the photographs had finished mattering. Not Farouk's mistake. A structural one, the kind that emerges from the gap between what an operation looks like on paper and what it feels like to run it from inside a community where every deviation from routine is noticed by people who have known you for 20 years. The Israeli network mobile phone that Farouk was using to track the movements of a specific Hezbollah parliamentarian operated on a frequency band that, in 2007, a Lebanese army signals unit began monitoring more carefully than it had before. Not because they were looking for Farouk, because they were conducting a broad sweep of unusual network activity in the south, looking for anything that appeared to originate from a node that should not exist in a Hezbollah-adjacent area. The sweep did not find Farouk. It found an anomaly that was logged, filed, and forwarded to a unit that would not look at it seriously for another 2 years. He did not know any of this. He continued using the phone. In the summer of 2008, Farouk stopped for 3 weeks. Not officially, not through any communication to his handler that constituted a formal suspension of the operation. He simply stopped. The device in the light was not triggered. The transfers did not happen. He went to work, treated patients, said the right things in the right company, and produced nothing. From the outside, the 3 weeks looked identical to every other 3 weeks. From the inside, they were the closest Farouk came to ending his own involvement unilaterally, not through confession, not through extraction, but through the simple act of cessation, of becoming, temporarily, only what he appeared to be. What broke the pause was not a threat, it was the opposite. A patient came in, a mid-level Hezbollah logistics coordinator who had been to the clinic twice before, and during the appointment said something. Not classified, not operational. A casual remark about a meeting that had happened. A location mentioned by its neighborhood rather than its address. A name dropped the way people drop names when they are relaxed and in pain and talking to someone they trust. The information was minor, but it was real, and the instinct that had been suppressed for 3 weeks reasserted itself with a force that Farouk found, later, he could not fully explain. He triggered the camera. He resumed the transfers. The false start had lasted exactly 22 days. The operation continued. What Farouk did not know, what his handler did not tell him, and may not have known with certainty at the time, was that the 3-week pause had been noticed. Not by Hezbollah, by the Israeli side of the operation. A gap in the intelligence flow had generated a review. The review had produced questions that were forwarded down the chain in the careful, indirect language that intelligence communications use when they are asking, "Is the asset still functional, or have we lost him?" The answer, by the time the question arrived, was already obsolete. He had resumed. The gap was explained as a period of reduced patient volume, a plausible seasonal variation for a dental clinic in a region still rebuilding from a 2-year-old war. The explanation was accepted. The review was closed. This is the false release moment. The moment where the pressure drops, the machinery exhales, and the assumption reasserts itself that the cover is intact, the asset is stable, and the operation is running within acceptable parameters. The problem with false release moments in long-running operations is that they do not release anything. They defer. The tension that appeared to resolve does not disappear, it redistributes into the structure of the operation itself, into the assumptions that nobody goes back to question because the immediate crisis has passed. After the review closed, the requests accelerated again. The 3-week pause had created a backlog of urgency on the receiving end. Farouk was asked to be more attentive, more precise, more timely. The calendar of patient appointments that had always been his operational cover was now also his operational pressure. He needed specific people in the chair. He needed them soon. For the first time in the operation, Farouk was not simply recording what came to him naturally. He was being asked to shape what came to him. He began carefully to suggest appointments, not aggressively, not in any way that could register as unusual. A word to a community figure about the importance of regular dental hygiene. A reminder sent through a mutual contact that he had availability on a specific day. The kind of gentle social engineering that a trusted community dentist could perform without raising any eyebrows at all, because dentists remind patients to come in. That is what dentists do. The incorrect assumption playing out here was one that both Farouk and his handler shared, that because the social engineering was invisible to outside observers, it was also invisible in its effects, that influencing who came to the clinic on which days would produce no traceable pattern. But Hezbollah's rebuilt counterintelligence methodology, the one assembled after 2006, the one that had gone back and re-examined known individuals with updated criteria, was not looking for dramatic events, it was looking for patterns. Specifically for the kind of micro-patterns that emerge when an apparently passive individual begins making small, consistent adjustments to their social behavior. A dentist who reminds people to come in is unremarkable. A dentist who, in a specific 12-month window, has managed to treat an above-average number of organizationally significant patients, not dramatically above average, not impossibly concentrated, just slightly more than probability alone would predict, is a data point. Data points accumulate. They do not announce themselves. They simply sit in a file next to other data points until someone runs an analysis that connects them. Farouk had no way of knowing that the analysis had been run. He had no way of knowing what it had produced. He was operating in the final phase of the operation on the assumption that the cover was intact, because nobody had behaved differently toward him, because no alarm had sounded, because the community still treated him exactly as they always had. That assumption was now wrong. It had been wrong for several months. There is a particular cruelty in the architecture of how long running intelligence operations end. They do not end with a dramatic confrontation, a chase, a moment of discovery where everything is suddenly visible to everyone simultaneously. They end the way water enters a closed room, slowly, from multiple directions, through gaps so small they are individually invisible. Farouk kept working. He treated patients. He triggered the camera when the right people sat down. He made his transfers through channels that had worked for years and showed no sign of compromise. He had one more conversation with someone he trusted, a community figure, a man who had known him since before the clinic opened, who stopped by one evening and asked, in the careful way that people ask things they already partially know, how business was going, whether he had been busy lately, whether he had seen much of certain people. The questions were ordinary. The tone was ordinary. The man's face, in the lamplight of Farouk's front room was ordinary. Farouk answered everything correctly. He gave the right answers in the right sequence with the right amount of detail, not too much, not too little. He had been giving right answers for 9 years. He was very good at it. The man left. Farouk sat with the conversation afterward, turning it over, testing each question against his answers, looking for the thread he might have exposed. He found nothing. Every answer had been clean. He made one final decision, in the quiet of that evening, that the conversation had been exactly what it appeared to be: routine, friendly, unremarkable. He was wrong, but he would not know that for several more months. And in those months, he kept the appointment book full. He kept his hand steady. He kept the light on above the chair, waiting for the next face that needed to be seen. The arrest did not come as a raid. It came as an invitation, a request that Farouk present himself to a Lebanese security office for what was described, through the intermediary who delivered the message, as a routine administrative matter. The kind of bureaucratic summons that, in post-war southern Lebanon, was common enough to be unremarkable. He went, because not going would have been the thing that confirmed what going might only suggest. This is the final expression of the trap that a long-running deep cover operation builds around its own asset. By the time the arrest comes, the asset cannot run. Not because they lack the means, but because running is the one action that closes every remaining door simultaneously. The cover that has protected them for years now holds them in place at the moment they most need to move. The identity that made them invisible makes them immovable. Farouk walked into that office carrying 9 years of practiced normalcy. He sat down. He answered questions. He held the cover for as long as the cover could be held. It could not be held long enough. The Lebanese security officers conducting the interrogation were not working from suspicion. They were working from a file. The anomaly logged in 2007, the unusual network signal from the Israeli frequency phone, had been connected 2 years later to a pattern analysis of Farouk's patient scheduling. That analysis had been connected to the re-examination of his brother's SLA history, now framed not as settled past but as active vulnerability. The file was not complete. It did not need to be complete. It needed only to be sufficient. The interrogation lasted long enough for the architecture of the cover to develop the one crack that 9 years of maintenance had prevented. Not a dramatic revelation. A small inconsistency. A timeline that did not align perfectly. An answer that was technically correct, but carried a weight that a man with nothing to hide would not have given it. He confessed. Not immediately, not in the first session. But the confession, when it came, was detailed in a way that only a man who had been carrying a precise and organized secret for 9 years could produce. Dates, coordinates, methods of transfer, the nature of the phone tracking operation, the modification to the examination light, the handler relationship, described through the layered indirection of a man who understood that some details protected others more than they protected himself. The confession was, in its own way, the last professional act of a man who had been operating professionally for 9 years. He gave what could not be withheld. He withheld what might still matter. The intelligence produced by the dental chair operation did not expire when Farouk was arrested. Intelligence does not work that way. The photographs, the coordinates, the movement patterns, the infrastructure maps, they had already been processed, filed, cross-referenced, and integrated into a targeting architecture that continued to function independently of its source. What Mossad had built over the years of Farouk's operation was not a collection of isolated intelligence items. It was a foundation layer, a visual and geographic database of Hezbollah's command structure in the south that became the baseline against which all subsequent intelligence was measured. New information arriving after 2009 was compared against that baseline. Changes in personnel, location, behavior, all of it was readable only against the context that the earlier intelligence had established. The dental chair operation had not just produced data. It had produced the interpretive framework that made later data meaningful. This is the part of the story that neither the Lebanese tribunal record nor the public intelligence literature fully traces, the chain of consequence that runs from a small clinic in Marjayoun forward through 8 years of escalating Israeli operations against Hezbollah's military command. The 2006 war targeting. The sustained campaign from 2009 through 2012 that Israeli and international analysts have described as the most significant degradation of Hezbollah's military infrastructure since the organization's founding. The precision of strikes that, in retrospect, demonstrated a level of internal knowledge that Hezbollah's own postmortems could not fully account for. And then, further forward, September 2024. Hassan Nasrallah had survived for 18 years after the 2006 war by making himself completely invisible. No public appearances, no predictable location. A security apparatus designed around the assumption that Israel's greatest intelligence advantage was electronic, signals, satellites, drones, and that physical obscurity could defeat it. What that security apparatus could not account for was the depth of the human intelligence layer that had been built underneath it. Not one asset, not one operation, dozens. A network assembled over decades through the particular Mossad methodology of finding people who were already trusted, already present, already invisible, and giving their private decisions a direction. The bunker in Beirut's southern suburbs where Nasrallah died was located through intelligence that included, somewhere in its foundation, the work of people like Farouk. The precision guidance devices planted in the building before the strike, the knowledge of which underground structure connected to which corridor, which exit led where, which location would be used on which day. That knowledge did not arrive fully formed in 2024. It was assembled, layer by layer, over 20 years, by assets whose names are mostly unknown and whose contributions are individually invisible. Farouk was one brick in that foundation, but the foundation held long after the brick was removed. His clinic did not reopen. This is the detail that carries the weight that statistics cannot. Not the sentence handed down by the military tribunal. Not the years of imprisonment. Not the public exposure of a name that had meant, for 2 decades, something entirely different to the people who heard it. The clinic did not reopen. The chair sat empty. The light above it, the ordinary, unremarkable, perfectly positioned light, was examined and then removed, and then the room was locked, and then the building was sold, and then it became something else. The community that had trusted Farouk for 20 years had to perform a retroactive revision of everything they remembered about him. Every appointment, every conversation in the waiting room, every moment of vulnerability, mouth open, head back, eyes closed against the brightness, reread through the knowledge of what the light had contained. Trust, once revised that way, does not simply transfer to the next available recipient. It contracts. People in communities that have experienced deep cover penetration do not become more skeptical of strangers. They become more skeptical of familiarity, of longevity, of the neighbor who has always been there, who has always been reliable, who has always been exactly what he appeared to be. The most lasting damage of a long-running human intelligence operation is not the intelligence it produces, or even the lives it costs. It is the revision it forces on everyone who believed the cover. Because those people have to live, afterward, with the knowledge that their trust was not defeated by a clever impersonation. It was defeated by a genuine relationship, repurposed. For Mossad, the institutional cost sits in a different register. The operation succeeded by every measurable metric. The intelligence was real, sustained, and consequential. The asset ran for 9 years in one of the most surveilled communities in the Middle East without being detected through any failure of tradecraft. And yet the methodology, finding assets whose covers are their lived lives, accelerating the operational tempo past what the human infrastructure can safely sustain, leaving extraction as a secondary concern to continued production, produced a man who was arrested, tried, and imprisoned while the operation that consumed his life continued without him. The question that intelligence institutions ask after an asset is burned is never whether the operation was worth it. That question is asked before. Afterward, the question is only, what did we learn about the methodology? What this operation teaches, if anyone in the relevant buildings is reading it honestly, is that the most durable cover is also the most costly one to lose. Because a fabricated identity, when burned, damages only the fabrication. A lived identity, when burned, damages everything the life contained. Farouk lost a clinic, a community, a name that had meant something, the version of himself that 20 years of neighbors remembered. None of that can be returned. Intelligence operations do not have a mechanism for returning what they repurpose from a human life. What remains is the broader question, the one this story does not answer, and cannot answer, and perhaps should not. How many more clinics in how many more towns are still running? How many lights are still on? If that question stays with you, if you find yourself reconsidering what ordinary trust looks like, then you understand exactly what Mossad understood in 2004, when they looked at a dentist in Marjayoun and saw not a man, but an architecture. That is what Hidden Ops is here to examine. Not to celebrate, not to condemn. To understand, clearly, carefully, and without looking away. Subscribe. The next operation is already running.